So I wanted to start off with a little reminder about what I did last week, uh, maybe looking at it from a methodological point of view, because I situated the argument of Hegel that we're talking about in a tradition, in sort of both directions. I look backwards at Hegel's critique of Kant's intuition concept distinction as a detailed motivation for Hegel's own immediate mediated distinction. And we saw that Hegel, in effect, distinguishes three dimensions of the intuition concept distinction and promises that in his own use of immediate and mediated, he's going to keep careful track of those. So that's looking at Hegel's argument against the background of his Kantian inheritance. But I also looked forward at his alternative to what we can now see was the extensional Tarskian order of explanation. Remember, I'd introduced Hegel's argument as starting with his distinction between two kinds of difference, mere difference and exclusive difference, and argued that the development, the exposition in the perception chapter finds implicit in that distinction between two kinds of difference, two kinds of negation, he'll say, finds implicit in that the distinction between objects and properties, or particulars and universals. And I contrasted his order of explanation with the extensional, with the later extensional Tarskian order of explanation, which begins with mere differences of objects, by contrast to Hegel's order of explanation, which is beginning with exclusive difference of what eventually show up as properties. Now, I think that constellation of ideas, that opposition, should be part of the conversation in contemporary analytic metaphysics. But at any rate, I think it evidently sheds light on what Hegel is doing to look at it retrospectively from what we've come to understand by our inheritance of that extensional Tarskian order of explanation. We wouldn't be able to see that what he's doing is a converse order of explanation if we didn't have that later example. And looking at one of the dimensions that he discerns within the Kantian intuition concept distinction, his point that deixis and indexicality, token reflexiveness, presupposes anaphora in the sense that you can only have episodes or performances with deictic or indexical, unrepeatable significance if you also have some way of preserving or reappropriating or repeating the content of the original. That's anaphora. But once again, we've studied those phenomena a lot in the intervening 250 years, 220 years, and can understand what he's doing better because of that. This is the sort of historical recollective methodology that I'm bringing to reading this text. It's why I'm not bashful about invoking things that happened later as well as things that happened earlier in trying to illuminate his text. So to remind you a little bit further about last time, we left off after looking at perception, which was Hegel's name for a form of empirical self-consciousness, what he calls a shape of consciousness, which I understand as a constellation of metaconcepts or a categorical structure that in the particular case of perception, understands empirical knowing as a grasp of sense universals, as the passive taking in of observable properties, the ones that we can take in non-inferentially. And one of the principal lessons I suggested that Hegel was teaching is the Salarzian lesson that sense of non-inferential, the sense in which non-inferential reports or perceptual judgments that are non-inferentially arrived at are non-inferential, non-inferentiality of origin, the fact that the advent of the episode of judgment or of perception is not the end result of a process of inference. Observationality, in that sense, by exercising reliable differential responsive dispositions, shouldn't be confused with and doesn't entail non-inferentiality of content. The idea that you could grasp the content of the episode that is non-inferentially triggered, apart from practically being able to situate it in a space of implications, as a node of a set of inferential moves. All the concepts that have non-inferential uses must also have inferential ones. If they're to be cognitively significant, they have to at least be able to serve as premises of inference, provide evidence for us to draw further conclusions. But now, the point of many that he made in the perception chapter that most directly leads to the third chapter, Force and Understanding, our topic today, is that implicit in our grasp of sense universals is knowledge of things that are not sense universals, namely the objects whose observable properties they are, the particulars that exhibit those universals. He argued that we can't grasp the determinate content of those sense universals, that's his term, those observable properties, unless we understand the relation that they stand in to the objects that exhibit them. We saw him elaborating the distinction between the object as also and the object as one, the object as the medium of compatible properties, and the object as a unit of account excluding incompatible properties. Well, the point that matters for moving to force and understanding is these objects are not sense universals. They're not non-inferentially accessible to us in the same way that properties like red or being a dog are. We infer them from the presence of the sense universals. We learn about them inferentially. And they open up the topic then of inferential knowledge as a necessary component of the non-inferential knowledge that sense certainty and perception share as part of their understanding of empirical knowledge. Thinking about inferentially arrived at knowledge, that's the topic of and the center of the form of empirical self-consciousness that Hegel, following Kant, will call understanding. And I claim that the first topic of that chapter is things that can only be known inferentially, purely inferential items of knowledge, theoretical objects. And my claim is that the notion of force in Hegel's discussion is allegorical for theoretical objects generally. I say allegorical here. I think strictly rhetorically, it's synecdoche. That's the trope where a part stands in for the whole. Forces are theoretical objects, but it's by thinking about this paradigmatic instance of theoretical objects that we're to learn about theoretical objects generally. I use the more general rhetorical trope allegory because I think we'll see later on that allegory is the more general trope that we'll find. Discussion of things like the master and the slave is allegorical. The official topics, the manifest content of most of the book should be understood allegorically. And the notion of force is the first one. So the first movement, the first third of structurally of this third chapter is about force. And it's got three parts: force and its expression, the doubling of forces, and the play of forces. And I'll say something about each of those. If and insofar as Hegel speaks allegorically of largely semantic issues, but logical, metaphysical issues, these are all ways of we can talk about the same philosophical topics that he has, then it's going to be very important that we keep two sets of books when we're reading him. One is what's going on in the allegory, and then second, what's it allegorical for? What lessons are we supposed to learn outside of it? And here, inside the allegory, the discussion of force is set in the conceptual framework of Newtonian physics as formulated by Roger Boscovich and following him, Kant. This is Boscovich in 1758 gave a version of Newtonian physics that doesn't have mass in it. In place of mass are more forces. Particles are thought of as points that repel other points. Solidity is understood in terms of force. And 30 years later, in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, Kant follows this Boscovichian way of thinking about Newtonian physics, where there really is only one theoretical concept, force. It's elaborated to do the work of mass in Newton's system. And as the Boscovichian allegory first shows up in Hegel's text, at its center is the distinction between force and its expression. If we think about the Newtonian case, the expression of force is acceleration. That's something that's observable. The expression of force, the manifestation of it, is its observable manifestations. But the force itself, the thought is, has to be inferred from what can be observed, namely the accelerations. And in the first form of understanding consciousness, the observable expressions of unobservable forces show up as appearances that mediate our inferential epistemic access to the underlying reality that is the force that's expressed. So the way we know about the force is by its expression. That's an appearance. It's something observable, but it stands between us and the forces because we're going to infer the presence and the features of the forces from the observable properties of its manifestations. So Hegel says, this is in paragraph 145, our object is thus from now on the syllogism, Schluss, which has for its extreme terms the inner of things and the understanding. The inner of things is the force, understanding is at the other end, and for its middle term has appearances, has the manifestation, the expression of the force. And Hegel thinks here that there's a striking reversal of the picture that perception inherited from sense certainty. Perception and sense certainty identified the objects of knowledge with what was perceptible, with what could be non-inferentially known, with what was observable. But now we've got a reversal of that. The appearance, the manifestation of the force, what's observable, is there just to give us epistemic access to the reality that stands behind it. The theoretical item, the force that we're to infer from it, that's the Schluss, the syllogism, we're to infer the existence and the nature of the underlying reality, which is not directly observable, from the appearance which is observable. So what's real, what he calls the inner nature of things, is now identified with that theoretical, cause of sense and goal of intellect. It's the cause of the appearances, and it's what we're trying to find out about inferentially by making inferences from the evidence provided by the senses about its manifestation. We can, if we look back on this, we can think about this as a kind of scientific realism, which is a realism in a sense that's opposed to instrumentalism. That is, it's a realism about theoretical entities. Instrumentalism didn't exist as such in Hegel's time. By the end of the 19th century, it would, and loomed large in the first half of the 20th century. Instrumentalism that says what's real is what's observable, and theoretical claims are just, and the theoretical objects that they're about are just posits that we make in order to organize the observations and let us move more smoothly around them. Scientific realism about theoretical objects says, no, the theoretical objects are real. They're as real as observable things. The kind of realism that Hegel is pointing to here is stronger than just the claim that theoretical entities, electrons, genes, are real or can be real, even though they're not observable. It's the claim that all that's real, what's really real, is what the scientific theory tells us is those theoretical objects. I call this Eddingtonian realism, looking at the identification of reality with theoretical entities that Arthur Eddington, the physicist, famously endorsed in his 1927 Gifford lectures on the nature of the physical world, using his image of the two tables, the solid, colored, unmoving, perceptible table of what Sellers will later call the manifest image, and the constellation of colorless, charged particles whizzing about at great speed, never at rest, always vibrating in largely empty space, which Eddington calls the scientific table. So he used this trope of the manifest table, the table we perceive, and the scientific table, different in every regard. The one has a color, the other doesn't. The one's at rest, the other's in motion. The one is solid, the other is largely empty. But Eddington's verdict on the relation between them is clear. He says, quote, "I need not tell you that modern physics has by delicate test and remorseless logic assured me that my second scientific table is the only one which is really there. The observable table is merely its appearance." Hegel says, in the paragraph before the one I read a minute ago, took the passage from a minute ago, that is in 144, in this, what is the inner true has come to be for the understanding for the first time, and from now on, there opens up over and above the sensuous as the appearing world, a supersensible world as the true world. So this Eddingtonian scientific realism about theoretical entities is invidious. It not only distinguishes between what's observable and what's theoretically postulated, what's non-inferentially available to us through the exercise of reliable differential responsive dispositions to apply observational concepts, and what's only inferentially available. It not only distinguishes between those, but it says there's a fundamental difference between them, that reality is the unobserved theoretical entities that stand behind the appearance. The appearance is a mere appearance. It's an appearance of reality, but it's merely a means, an epistemic means for us to find out about what's real. So the first form of the understanding consciousness, this third form of empirical self-consciousness that Hegel considers, is invidious Eddingtonian scientific realism about theoretical entities, which lines up the distinction between observable and theoretical entities and properties with the distinction between appearance and reality. Now, instrumentalism did that too, but the valence is reversed. Instrumentalism says it's the observable and only the observable that's real. The theoretical, that's just a calculational what if device. Eddingtonian scientific realism about theoretical entities lines up appearance and reality with observation and theory, lines up those two distinctions, but the other way around, and says what's real is the theoretical. So at this point, we have a veil of appearance view where we need to pierce that veil, to go beyond that veil by making inferences from what's observable to what's really out there, which is only theoretically observable. it's lining up an epistemological distinction, the distinction between what we can know about non-inferentially as opposed to what we can only find out about inferentially. That's an epistemological distinction. It's lining that up with an ontological distinction between things that are real and things that merely appear to us, that are the appearances of the real things. Sellers calls the idea that you can read ontological distinctions off of epistemological ones, the Platonic principle. He's thinking of Plato taking what we know by sense and what we know by intellect, that methodological or epistemological distinction as the key to the fundamental distinction between two kinds of things, the realm of becoming and the realm of being. And Hegel's view is that Platonic principle is a mistake. It's a mistake to identify the difference between things we find out about inferentially and things we find out about non-inferentially, to construe that as an ontological distinction between two kinds of things. Now, Sellers has a wonderful discussion about this, whose moral is, whose lesson is that the distinction between observable and purely theoretical entities is a methodological distinction, not an ontological distinction. If you think about Pluto, formerly known as a planet, ninth out in our solar system, it started off life related to us as a theoretical entity. There were perturbations observed in the orbit of Neptune, and it turned out you could nicely account for those if you postulated a small body with a certain mass and a certain position and orbit. We could only know anything about Pluto inferentially. It was purely theoretical at that point. And at the distance that it was and the size that it was beyond observation, even with our best instruments, until 1930, when Clyde Tombaugh turned, I think it was the Yerkes telescope, to where theory said this postulated entity should be, and observed it. And since then, we've observed it in spades. We've sent satellites out to look at it and so on. With that first observation, it changed status from being a purely theoretical object, one we could only know about by a process of inference from observing other things, to an observable object. And obviously, Pluto didn't change. This was a change in its relation to us. We gained a new way of knowing about it. That's all that changed. It didn't become a new kind of thing. And the claim is going to be that, and this is a claim that Sellers makes explicitly, that there is nothing that in principle is only available inferentially. Something that it's not just we can't, as a matter of fact, observe it, but that in principle it cannot be observed. I mean, we may not be able to implement the antecedents of the subjunctive conditional describing the circumstances under which we would observe it. It's outside our light cone or whatever. But this status of being something that's only accessible to us inferentially, or also available to us non-inferentially, that's a historically dated status that changes. It's not marking a fundamental ontological difference between things. It's a mistake, in other words, to line up the appearance-reality distinction with the observable theoretical distinction in either direction, either the way instrumentalists do, or the way invidious Eddingtonian scientific realists about theoretical entities do. Treating, and this is going to open up the way for, well, all right, I'll leave it there. Yeah, Sequoia, did you have a?
I just had a question about this with the Pluto example and with the idea that that there is no potentially non-inferentially known theoretical objects. Does this then commit somebody like Sellers and Hegel to a Parmenidean view of the universe where everything is stable and non-evolving? Or would this allow us to have a more Heraclitean view where nature itself is changing and our laws may at some point not be applicable?
I mean, I don't think the one point actually bears on the other. I mean, as a matter of fact, both Hegel and Sellers think of the world as evolving, but this point is that our the fact that our epistemic relation to things evolves shows that we shouldn't use it to draw fundamental categorical ontological distinctions. We shouldn't identify the mode of access we have with fundamental ontological distinctions. So, Hegel is seeing this first form of what he calls a super-sensible world, the world as beyond our senses. He says, this first conception, it's a mistake. It's a mistake whether avant la lettre one makes it in the instrumentalist way, or he's already conceiving making it in the Eddingtonian way. Now, that's not telling us how we ought to think about it yet, just rejecting that. Yes, Katja.
Sorry, I also try to make sense of it. And can we understand it like Thomas Kuhn's in Structural Scientific Revolution says that when a paradigm changes and a new kind of reality evolves, can one understand it like something of this?
I mean, the new paradigm is giving us new concepts, and there is a connection between these in that the new concepts can be purely theoretical, or they can also come to have observational uses. But they needn't come to have observational uses in order to turn out to be real. So the paradigm shift that brought us to the Rutherford picture of the atom as a kind of tiny solar system with electrons in orbit around a nucleus, that was a purely theoretical shift in the way we thought about microstructure, and at the time wasn't observable at all. But we've come to be able to observe those electrons and those neutrons and so on, those nuclei, perfectly well. Okay. Now, in Hegel's evolution of this story, the next phase is the duplication of forces. He imagines us saying, well, why is it that force expresses itself in an observable way? Why is it that something observable is a consequence of the force? And says, well, something must have happened. It must be that two forces are interacting, two theoretical entities have interacted in order to produce an observable manifestation. He talks about the solicited force and the soliciting force. It quickly moves beyond that to what he calls the play of forces. Realizes there needn't just be one of them. There's this whole set of in allegory forces whose interaction as their relations among the forces change. Sometimes that produces an expression that is perceptible by us. Sometimes it doesn't. They're just interacting without causing something that's sensible by us, observable by us. But what's important about that interaction, he's looking at it, this is the first manifestation of what's going to be a thoroughgoing holism. We have to understand the whole play of forces here. But he realized what's important about the play of forces is not just the forces, but the laws that govern their interaction, that determine what the consequences of some particular constellation of forces is in the allegory, what the laws are that govern the theoretical entities in the broader, outside the allegory, in the broader area that he's addressing here, because it's those laws that let us make inferences from the appearances to the underlying reality. He says a couple of paragraphs on from where I was citing before, I'll say in general, just observe in general, the Forced Understanding chapter is just 34 paragraphs long, and there's a lot going on in it. The arguments are very compressed. He says in paragraph 148, the understanding, which is our object, that is, it's the form of phenomenal self-consciousness that is the object of us, the phenomenological, philosophical self-consciousness. The understanding, which is our object, finds itself in just this position, that the inner world has come into being for it, to begin with, only as the universal still unfilled in itself, the an sich, what there is in itself. The play of forces has this merely negative significance of being in itself nothing, and its only positive significance, that of being the mediating agency, but outside of the understanding. Mediating agency in that its laws are going to permit us to find out about it inferentially. What is immediate for the understanding is the play of forces. But what is the true for it is the simple inner world. And this is going to be the next form of supersensible world that he considers the next expressively progressive step in the self-understanding of empirical self-consciousness. So at this point, we're accepting the ontological legitimacy of merely inferentially accessible entities. That's the one step in advance from perception, but we're rejecting the temptation to identify reality with all and only the inferentially accessible entities. And we're on the way to a holistic conception of what it is for one of the forces to be the force that it is. It's for it to interact with the other forces in the way that it does. This corresponds to a shift in focus from the relata of the play of forces, the theoretical entities, to the relations. Because we've learned those relations are what functionally define and determine those relata. Instead of asking about the nature and the ontological status of theoretical entities in the sense of items that are, at least at this stage in our development, only inferentially accessible, semantically and epistemically, to empirical consciousness, understanding consciousness, that is, empirical self-consciousness, understanding itself according to the categories of understanding, now asks about the relations in virtue of which anything is inferentially accessible. These are the lawful relations of necessity and possibility and impossibility that determine the actual interactions of things, of the determinately, in the end, conceptually contentful states of affairs that we think about. The second supersensible world, in his phrase, is what he calls the calm realm of laws. The thought here is what's real is that structure of necessity that governs the contingent interactions of the particular theoretical entities, and is that in virtue of which we can get access to them if we inferentially track the sort of lawful relations among them. We can work back from the manifestation that's the result of a play of forces, of the interaction of theoretical entities. But what's real is this calm realm of laws. And everything else is a contingent expression of them. There's some boundary conditions. Under those boundary conditions, the laws have the observable consequences that they do and the unobservable consequences that they do. But the inner reality of that realm that we have both non-inferential access to via the manifestations of the interactions of the play of forces and the forces themselves. The inner reality of that is the laws that govern them. Everything else is a contingent manifestation of those laws. So here, I think the structure of force and its observable manifestations, that same structure has now been taken over And we have the laws as what's taken to be real, and the play of forces as just its contingent manifestation. Now the manifestation isn't identified with what appears to us non-inferentially. We've drilled down to a deeper reality, the laws behind the forces. And Hegel thinks this is a progressive move. We've shaken off the identification of the appearance reality distinction with the observable theoretical distinction. We're now identifying appearance and reality not with our sensory, with what's observable given our contingent sensory abilities, but rather with the contingent necessary distinction. The calm realm of laws, that's the necessary, that's necessary and is what's real. And the whole play of forces, including its observable manifestations, but they don't have any privileged status in this, the whole play of forces is the contingent manifestation of this underlying realm, calm realm of laws. And here again, he wants to say, there's something progressive about that. We are drilling down toward reality. But there's a fundamental philosophical mistake in the vicinity, in thinking of the calm realm of laws as a supersensible world, as what's real, of which the play of forces, the theoretical entities, and their antics is merely a contingent manifestation. So in order to get a proper appreciation of the insight of the step forward that we've taken, we've got to be able to divide through by this philosophical mistake. And the philosophical mistake is reifying the laws, treating the laws as super facts, treating the laws as something that's out there that we could describe in a sense that's recognizably, generically the same as the sense in which we can describe facts that are governed by those laws. The mistake is thinking of the laws as something we can represent in something like the same sense in which we can represent the facts by describing them, by representing, by stating them. To think of the statement of a law, F equals MA, say, as describing a kind of fact. I called it a super fact. That's not his terminology. Precisely because it stands in this distinctive relation to bodies attracting and repelling each other according to the law F equals MA. But thinking of the reality underlying what's empirically accessible to us, not just observationally, but inferentially, the whole empirical world as the manifestation of this underlying reality that is its lawful structure, calm realm of laws is to make a fundamental semantic mistake about the character of statements of laws. It's to reify laws as a kind of super fact. Now he's going to diagnose this problem, and we're going to want to know, well, then how should we think about it? If the laws, if when I state the law, force is the product of mass and acceleration, what am I doing if I'm not describing a necessary structure of the world? Okay, a structural fact about it, because it's manifested in necessary connections, not merely contingent ones. But if we're not going to think about that as a kind of super fact, how are we going to think about it? How should we think about it? And he's going to have a remarkable response to that. This is our first step beyond a representational model to an expressive model. And this is one of the deep and difficult lessons of this chapter. The notion of representation, of description as fact stating, is going to have a place in the structure, but it's at the ground level. That's what ordinary determinate concepts are for. They stand in descriptive representational relations to the facts that they let us state. Facts about empirical reality, which we now see for it to be empirical reality, reality that's empirically accessible to us, should not be identified with just its observable manifestations. Empirical reality extends to the forces, to the theoretical entities that are genuinely accessible to us inferentially, and which are empirically real. But that's not the way we should think about their lawful structure, but the modal articulation of the world. Taking this to be an absolutely central philosophical question, how to understand the modal character of the world, of the relations that we find in the world, the lawful relations. That's characteristic of the German idealist tradition, by contrast to the empiricist tradition, which has by and large been dominant in Anglophone philosophy ever since Hegel, well, since before him. Not universally, because there still were idealists for a while. There was Bradley in Britain and Royce in the States. And for them, lawfulness was absolutely the central thing we needed to understand. And there were the American pragmatists who similarly took lawfulness to be, and modality to be, perhaps the most important target of our philosophical understanding, being the American pragmatists being true to their German idealist roots. But empiricists downstream from Hume, culminating nearly in our time in Quine, read this out of their world. Modality was pushed to the edge. Now, Hegel, I think, in the discussion of the common realm of laws, merely asserts that it's a mistake to think about it representationally or descriptively. There is an argument, but the argument comes later on. We're still really in the first third of the chapter here. Well, second, third. Force is the first, and then force and law. And this is a discussion of law. And the third part is where we concern ourselves with law and explanation. That's the trajectory through it. But before he passes on from a discussion of law to explanation and begins to outline his positive account, the direction in which he thinks a proper philosophical understanding of these phenomena should go. He gives us another version of the supersensible world, another version of the reification of the modal aspects of reality, identifying what's real with this modal structure. And it's one that, once again, he thinks involves an expressively progressive step. It involves a real lesson, but mistakes it. And this is the notorious inverted world. It's another way of reifying modalities. And here, passage from paragraph 158, the real world is an inverted world. This is a successor notion to the calm realm of laws. He says, according then to the law of this inverted world, what is like in the first world, the uninverted world, is unlike to itself. Expressed in determinate moments, he's talking about now determinate concepts, not philosophical ones. This means that what in the law of the first world is sweet, in this inverted in itself is sour. What in the former is black is in this other one white. The inverted world is a world in which everything is the opposite of what it is in the uninverted world. And the claim is this is what's really behind the empirically accessible world. This is the reality. This is the next form of seeing what's empirically accessible as merely the appearance, the manifestation of something deeper, something that's behind it. So we saw that first with force and its expression, its manifestation. Mistakenly identifying appearance with what was observable and reality with what was inferentially accessible. We saw it again with the calm realm of laws, where what we had learned to be the whole empirical world, available to us not just through our senses, but also inferentially. Inference from observation is another mode of empirical access. That's what makes that world, the play of forces, including its sensible manifestations, but not restricted to that. All of that was seen as the expression of the underlying calm realm of laws. That was the second version of this same picture. Now, in the third one, it says the empirical world, the empirically accessible world, is a manifestation of its inversion, the inversion that in which everything is its opposites, or at least things that are exclusively different from it, its contraries. And that's the inversion. Now, this discussion has driven people crazy. On the face of it, it doesn't make any sense, according to an argument that Hegel already made in the perception chapter. The opposites of any given state of affairs, the things that contrast, that are exclusively different from it, never mind its contradictories, contradict each other. They're incompatible with each other. You can't have a world in which each thing is the opposite of what it is here. Objects don't have opposites. The opposite would have all the properties that were exclusively different from the properties that the object actually has, and those are incompatible with each other. They don't add up to an object. So this conception is incoherent on the face of it. Well, no, it's not. It is only if you think that the inverted world is a world. But it isn't. It's the inversion of a world. And he says that explicitly, that the inverted world isn't a world. It's the inversion of a world. What the conception is saying any determinate state of affairs, that the sugar is sweet, is the determinate state of affairs that it is only in virtue of its relations of exclusive difference to all the other possible things it could be. That it could be sour, that it could be salty, and so on. The determinateness of any, we can just focus on the property or on a state of affairs. The determinateness of that state of affairs consists in its relations of exclusive difference to a whole cloud of other possible states of affairs that are not actual. That's a view of conceptual contentfulness, a holistic view of it, on beyond the holism of the play of forces or the holism of the calm realm of laws. It's understanding each state of affairs as surrounded by a cloud of merely possible, strongly contrasting states of affairs. And it's those relations of material incompatibility that make it the determinate state of affairs that it is. That's the progressive step that the inverted world conception of a supersensible world makes. Because that's right. That's what it is for something to be a determinate property or state of affairs. It's to be a node in a relation, in a relational structure of contrasting properties. And essentially not just merely different ones, but strongly different ones, incompatible ones. As long as you don't think at the level of worlds and think the inverted world is a world, think that what you get when you invert the world is a world, there's nothing wrong with thinking about each state of affairs as being the state of affairs it is because of its relation to a penumbra of possible, merely possible states of affairs that are exclusively different from it, that strongly contrast with it, that are materially incompatible with it. That's the way he thinks we should think about the determinateness of actual states of affairs. And here's the punchline of the story that Hegel couldn't give us. Only we, looking back, recollecting this story, can make. That picture is provably equivalent to the Lewisian picture of possible worlds, an understanding of modality in terms of possible worlds. It encodes exactly the same modal information that the possible worlds picture does. We can go in both directions. If you start with the inverted world picture and see each state of affairs as the state of affairs it is surrounded by this penumbra that is its inversion, that is all of the possible states of affairs that are materially incompatible with it, then a possible world is just a maximal compossible set of those states of affairs. You just, now we're going to add to the sugar being sweet, the salt being tart. Those are compatible states of affairs. So they can be in one possible world. The sugar being tart, that can't be in any possible world with the sugar being sweet. If we start from the side of the possible worlds, we think of a state of affairs as a set of possible worlds. We partition the universe of possible worlds into the set in which that state of affairs holds and the set in which it doesn't. And then we can construct the set of all the states of affairs that are incompatible with that state of affairs. Those will be all the ones whose set of possible worlds is disjoint from the set of possible worlds that's identified with the sugar being sweet. So we can reconstruct the inversion of the world, of any world in which sugar is sweet, from the possible worlds picture. You can either start with the whole world of compossible states of affairs and then contrast that with other maximal compossible states of affairs. Or you can start from the state of affairs, think of it as surrounded by all the non-compossible states of affairs, all the ones that are materially incompatible with it. And then if you want to build up possible worlds out of those, you can just take maximal compossible sets of those things. So in fact, in putting forward the inverted world, Hegel is putting forward possible world semantics, just done somewhat structurally differently, starting with the states of affairs instead of starting with the possible worlds. But we can go back and forth. And there's nothing unintelligible about it that isn't equally unintelligible about the possible world story. I say, as long as you don't make the mistake of thinking that the inversion of a world, what you get by adding these contrasting impossibilia around each, as long as you don't think that's a world. And he tells us explicitly, it's not. Now, before I pause for comments or questions about this, let me say, we should be interested then in Hegel's criticism of this view. What does he think is wrong with it? It is progressive. He thinks we've learned something genuine by understanding the determinateness of each state of affairs in terms of this cloud of contrasting impossibilia relative to it, the things it rules out. But, he says, if we make the same mistake there that we made with the previous version that was the calm realm of laws, we make that if we think that when we talk about these contrasting things, these merely possible contrasting things, that what we're doing is describing them in the same sense in which we describe the thing we invert. If we reify them, if we think of them as something like the world that was inverted, but having a special ontological status, being in a different ontological zip code. Now, he doesn't, no surprise, talk about zip codes. He says the mistake is thinking of these contrasting possibilia as jenseits, as like the things that we're inverting, but over there, as being in some other ontological realm, the realm of the real, whose mere contingent manifestation is the actual states of affairs. That's a mistake like reifying the calm realm of laws, thinking of the laws as superfacts. That's exactly, according to him, what Lewisian possible worlds talk to us. It thinks of the possible worlds in virtue of which we understand the determinate contentfulness of properties and states of affairs as sets of these as being just like the actual world, except merely possible. I mean, for Lewis, Mad Dog modal realist, there's only an indexical difference between them. The actual world is just the one we happen to be in. But the mistake is thinking of possibility as a realm of being like actuality, even just generically, so that what we do when we think about modality and think about laws and impossibility and material incompatibility, exclusive difference, what we do is step back into, in the familiar possible worlds case, a meta language in which to describe the universe of possible worlds. But thinking of that as a universe that contains as one of its distinguished elements actuality. And we say, well, of course, the others are merely possible. That's the jenseits, that's the over there. They're across this boundary. But what we do is describe them in the same way we describe the actual world, even though we may need to use a fancier vocabulary. Now, again, we're going to want to know, well, what's the alternative? If that representational picture, representing possibilities, describing them in a way generically, in a way that's recognizable as generically the same as the way we describe and represent actual facts, if that's a mistake, as his proleptic criticism, his criticism avant la lettre of late 20th century and 21st century modal metaphysics has it, what's the alternative? Well, I want to remind you, he's worried about this in 1806. He's putting forward a powerful critique of this way of thinking about modality in 1806. If people could have read him then, how different would the subsequent history of philosophy look? Well, we're in a position to read him here. I said the key to understanding this is to see the formal equivalence of the inverted world hypothesis and possible world semantics. And of course, we couldn't see that until we developed the possible world semantics. But in the third section of the force and understanding section, he's going to give us an alternative. We'll sketch it in the remaining, so the whole thing is only 34 paragraphs, but the stakes are high, and what a fabulous thing he's doing in 1806. Okay, are there questions or comments about this remark?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, yes, Siddharth.
Thanks. So I'm curious. So it's interesting about the connection with Lewisian modal metaphysics, but I was also curious about the connection with the Lewisian account of laws. And it seems to me that at least that account of laws, this Humean account of laws, so to speak, does not make the mistake of construing laws as the super facts, as you say, right? So it's sort of curious, interesting to me that Lewis in his metaphysics might be making a kind of move that Hegel would criticize, whereas in his account of laws, he isn't making a move that Hegel would criticize.
Well, good, because I mean, I hear you, and I mean, thereon hangs a tale to fill in how and why he's not making this mistake. But I agree with you, and it had not occurred to me, but that's a way of pointing to the advance that Hegel thinks there is between the calm realm of laws, reification of laws as superfacts on the one hand, and this way of thinking about modality as thinking about possibility as another realm of being, sort of at the same level as actuality, that the second one allows you to have a view of laws that doesn't treat them as just facts. Now, he's still going to see Lewis as making sort of in spades the mistake of reifying now the possibilities rather than the laws, the possible worlds, the possible states of affairs, that Lewis thinks, well, we'll just describe them in our modal meta language, and then we can have an extensional semantics for modality. That's that was the attraction of the Kripke semantics that kicked all this off. So, and I haven't said, that criticism is saying, well, that's the wrong way to think about it, but we got to see what he thinks the right way to think about it is first. I haven't given the argument against that yet. I've just been talking about sort of how high the stakes are for it. But yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks.
Yes, Katja.
In the beginning, Hegel makes this distinction between mere difference and exclusive difference, which is incompatibility. And all the other arguments are now building on the incompatibility moments. And when we're talking, and also this kind of inverted world, which is the opposite. So, and but what I don't understand, why are the mere different properties not also important for the determinateness? Because when we are talking about the lump of sugar, it is white and sweet and hard, and these are not incompatible moments, but they also define the determinateness of sugar, and not only it's the opposite of sourness.
Yeah, look, they are included. He just wants to insist that the mere differences aren't enough. And we can see that the mere differences have to be included because we need them in order to build, in order to get the notion of compossibility of states of affairs that we're going to use to reconstruct the notion of a possible world. So they're in there, but you need the exclusive differences. That's where the modal oomph comes from, is the exclusive difference.
And when you're talking in details of this difference between weak and strong individuational holism, then this is you don't exclude the mere differences. This is also only making a point. Okay, thanks.
I mean, if we think about Leibniz's law in terms of a mere difference and exclusive difference, there are no different objects that differ only in having merely different properties. They always, if they're different objects, they always also have exclusively different properties. And that's a topic on which Leibniz's law is silent, but that's front and center in Hegel's metaphysics. Okay, it's time for our break. I have 2:53, so let's come back at 3:08. Okay, anything anybody wants to say before I move on here? Okay, so the alternative picture that Hegel is going to offer us, I said before, it was to replace the notion of representation with a notion of expression, within which we would then find a limited role for the notion of representation or description of determinate states of affairs. Hegel talks about the possibilities, these contrasting properties or states of affairs that constitute the determinateness of any state of affairs by their relations of material incompatibility to it, by the strong contrasts that they offer to it. He talks about those inversions of it as being implicit in it, as being inside it. They're inner with respect to it. And grasping the content is going to be making them explicit, making them be something for consciousness and not merely internal to the thing. Here's a couple of passages from the transition to the final discussion. At 160, he says, from the idea of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous Vorstellung representation of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element. That's the other ontological zip code that we're putting the merely possible states of affairs in. And this absolute notion of the difference must be presented and understood purely as inner difference, something internal. Certainly, I put the opposite here and the other of which it is the opposite there. The opposite then is on one side, is in and for itself without the other. But just because I have the opposite here, in and for itself, it's the opposite of itself, or it has in fact the other immediately present in it. Breaking off from the quote for a minute, it is what it is because of these strong contrasts with all of the other properties. Thus, the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, i.e., the inversion of itself. It is itself and its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it difference as inner difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity. And 3 paragraphs later at 163, infinity, you should treat that notion as a black box at this point. It doesn't have anything to do with Kantorian infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement in which whatever is determined in one way or another, e.g. as being, is rather the opposite of that determinateness. This, no doubt, has been all along the soul of all that has gone before, but it's this explanation that it first freely stands forth. That's at 163. So those are the passages I want to say something about. The progression from force to law, which comes to be seen as the essence of force, and now to explanation, which comes to be seen as the essence of law. So here I'm using I'm suggesting we think about the inversion of the world, the inverted world, as just being a repackaging of exactly the same information that's in a Lewisian possible worlds account. Now remember how that Lewisian account goes. You say, look, I understand non-modal properties. Non-modal properties are what a thing has, and it's intelligible as having them without your looking outside the possible world in which they are. So I've got a copper cube, and those are extensional properties, being a cube, being copper, in that I don't need to know anything about what's going on in other possible worlds in order to make sense of what it is to be copper or to be a cube. Now, some other, and similarly, let's say, maybe white isn't a good example, but yes, being cubical for the salt, being crystalline for the salt are like that. And then the thought is, but not all properties are like that. The ones that the empiricists were puzzled about, things like the salt or the sugar sharing the property of being soluble in water. Well, now imagine a sample of salt that never for its life is actually in water. It gets destroyed, burned up before it's ever in water. But we say it nonetheless has for its entire life in the actual world this property of being water soluble. And that property is a modal property because it's a property that we have to think about subjunctively. What would happen if? And when we do that, we're asking, well, what does happen over there, jenseits, in another possible world, a possible world in which it is that sample of salt is put in the water. It does dissolve there. And what we're saying when we say it would dissolve here, it's soluble, is that it does dissolve over there in the other possible world, an accessible possible world. So we can understand these modal properties entirely in terms of non-modal properties if we've got the structure of possible worlds that we can describe. The non-modal properties are what they are just in virtue of the world that they're in. The modal properties, you have to look at what's true in neighboring worlds in order to know which modal properties something has in any world. That's the picture. And that's why we can give a sort of meta-extensional account of modality. We're quantifying over these possible worlds now and saying there is a world in which, this is put in what, well, in all the worlds in which we put the salt, all the possible worlds in which we put the salt in water, it does dissolve. So in every world, it is water soluble. It has this modal property. So the order of explanation goes from these non-modal properties to modal properties. And Hegel's claim is there are no non-modal empirical properties in that sense. Put in the Lewis talk, there are no properties. They can be what they are just in virtue of how it is in the world that they're actually in. It isn't copper unless it would melt at 1,054 degrees C. It isn't copper unless it would conduct electricity. Every empirical property has got subjunctive necessary conditions. It can't be copper, it can't be a cube, unless if we were to count its corners or measure the distance from the center, we would get a different number if we measured to the middle of one of the faces than if we measured to one of the vertices. There are no modally insulated empirical properties, ones that do not have necessary conditions that involve subjunctive features. Being the property that it is already involves all of these modal subjunctive facts. It's implicit, he's going to say, in it. That's at base what's wrong with the reification of possibilities, either packaging them in the inverted world way or in the possible world way. The way Sellers makes a point like this is to say description and explanation go hand in hand. Describing something as having an empirical property and explaining the possession of one empirical property by appealing to another one with a subjunctively robust inference connecting them. Those are two sides of one coin. Those come together. You can't have one of them without the other. He says, well, here, let me read. A couple of the Hegel. Well, I'm not seeing it, but I think it's on the handout where he says, the only reason empirical predicates make it possible to describe something rather than merely label it is that they stand in a space of implications connecting them to other empirical properties. And furthermore, those implications necessarily, at least some of them, necessarily support subjunctive inferences that if you did this, this would happen. that's another way of thinking about these strong contrasts. They support subjunctively robust inferences, and that's what we appeal to in explanation. Description and explanation go hand in hand. To be the empirical property that it is to stand in subjunctively robust implication relations to other determinate empirical properties. That's the picture of determinateness, in which possessing one property implicitly involves these modally robust connections to other properties of inclusion or of exclusion. You can derive the inclusions from the exclusions, that's another story, but that's why Hegel can focus on the determinate negations, the material incompatibilities. I mean, remember from my description of the bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism, we're to think about the facts as being the facts they are in virtue of their modally robust relations to a cloud of possible facts. The ones they necessitate are the ones that are incompatible with them, and the determinateness of our thoughts in the same way. Now, how's he going to argue for this? He says, how do you so much as understand what a law is? This is the Humean question. He says, what is it for there to be a lawful relation between two theoretical objects, two forces? Thinking of laws as what underwrite subjunctively robust inferences and exclusions. Your grip on that notion is through your capacity to engage in practices of explanation, of inferring the presence of one determinate empirical property from the presence of another. That if the copper were heated to 1054 degrees C, it would melt. What you have to do in order to understand the concept of law is to make subjunctively robust inferences, that is, to engage in practices of explanation. There's a relation of sense dependence between the concept of a law and the concept of explanation. It's a sense dependence in that you can't understand what a law is except by understanding what you're doing in inferring in the form of explaining. Invoking subjunctively robust inferential connections or implications as part of an explanation of why an object has one empirical property. Remember, not necessarily empirical properties include the theoretical ones, it needn't be observable, explaining why it has one empirical property by appeal to its possession of another one. It's maybe no surprise that you can't understand what explaining is without understanding law. But it's a reciprocal sense dependence. These concepts come together. It's not a reference dependence. There were laws before anybody engaged in explanation. Remember, I talked about response-dependent properties, beauty, star, and so on, where sense dependence and reference dependence come apart. The claim is law and explanation are two sides of one coin in this sense dependence sense. And as part of a package, the notion of fact is reciprocally sense dependent on the notion of stating facts, of asserting or judging that things are thus and so. You can't understand what a fact is, except by understanding that they're stateable, thinkable, judgeable contents. Similarly, for objects and properties, or particulars and universals, you can't understand what they are, except as part of a package that includes referring and classifying as discursive activities, practices that you engage in. No reference dependence claim there, just the reciprocal sense dependence claim. When we really learn that lesson, we see that the concepts we use to articulate the ontological structure of the world, of the objective empirical world, concepts like object and property and fact and law, the progression we've engaged in here, we see that those concepts, the ones we use to understand the structure of the objective empirical world, are reciprocally sense dependent on activities of ours, on our explaining and stating facts, explaining by invoking laws, relying on lawful relations in our subjunctively robust explanatory inferences, stating facts, making judgments, asserting them, in referring to particulars and classifying under universals. Those concepts come together. So if we want to be empirically self-conscious, if we want to understand what it is for us to know something empirically, know about a world, the way things are out there, if we want to be fully self-conscious as empirical knowers, we can't just worry about the categorical structure of the world. We have to worry about our discursive practices too. We have to understand them in order to understand the categorical structure of the world, the ontological structures of particulars, universals, facts, and laws. And that's the expository rationale for the narrative transition from consciousness to self-consciousness, from worrying about empirical knowing and the world that we know empirically, to worrying about us and our discursive activities, which is the topic of the next chapter of the Phenomenology. Remember the discussion of the structure last time. It's not that the form of self-consciousness that we start with, self-consciousness as desire, comes historically after, is an expressively progressive development from these shapes of consciousness we've looked at. Now, no, this transition is of a different shape, a different form than a different kind than the transitions within the sections. But the excuse for it is this, well, I've called it objective idealism, that is the appreciation of the um, reciprocal sense dependence of the concepts that articulate the structure of the objective empirical world, reciprocal sense dependence of that on these discursive activities that we engage in. And if that's all right, and description and explanation are two sides of one coin as activities, describing, representing, and explaining or inferring in a modally robust way, then there's no go to the Humean picture of merely describing, sort of understanding those non-modal properties, but being puzzled about laws and the modal properties and so on. The modal properties are implicit in the most basic kind of empirical determinate property. The modality is not a set of facts about somewhere else, some other possible world. It's implicit in our being aware of any empirical property at all, whether observationally or inferentially. That's the line he's taking. He's rejecting what Sellers calls descriptivism. The idea that, well, I think this passage is on the handout. Sellers says, once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe. Think about the modal concepts. The way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions, which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship and discourse, are not inferior, they're just different. The mistake, the reification of laws as superfacts, of the modal articulation of empirical properties as facts we can describe, but about other possible worlds, not about ours, or about the inversion of our world. That's to assume that the function of those modal concepts like law, that the function of them is to describe something, not exactly in actuality, but still to describe something. And he says, no, that's not the function of those concepts at all. Their function is to make explicit something that's implicit in the use of any empirical vocabulary at all, including ground level empirical descriptions. The mistake that possible worlds, semantics, and metaphysics shares with the inverted world, and indeed with the reification of the calm realm of laws, thinking of the laws as a kind of superfact, is a descriptivist mistake. It's to think that that modal vocabulary performs a descriptive function. It's just describing a different kind of fact. Insight, something over there. A modal fact, a fact about other possible worlds, not just the actual empirical world. When in fact, to say it's a law that all samples of pure copper will melt at 1,054 degrees C. What you're doing when you say that is endorsing a subjunctively robust inference, making explicit your endorsement of the goodness of the inference from somebody heated this sample to 1060 degrees C, so it would melt. It melted under those circumstances. It's a picture of modality as making explicit something that's implicit in using ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And it's a mistake to think that doing that is describing something else, some modal properties or stating modal facts. Now, this is programmatic. He's waving his hands here at an expressivist understanding of the function of the modal vocabulary that's turned out to be what we need to understand the determinateness of, on the one hand, empirical states of affairs, properties, objects, facts, laws, and on the other hand, the determinateness of the thoughts that we have about them. It's to reject the hegemony of that descriptivist assumption that statements of law, that invocation of modality must be performing a descriptive function. We can see it functions differently from ordinary empirical descriptions. So we say, well, yes, but the facts that it's stating, they're a different kind of fact. They're ontologically Jenseite over there, the other possibilities. So from the connection between description and explanation, between fact stating and subjunctively robust inference, Hegel is both diagnosing a picture of the empirical world and motivating a transition to looking at our discursive practices, at the practices of stating facts, referring to particulars, classifying them under universals, and making subjunctively robust inferences of the kind that are licensed by statements of law. So this is the culmination of his epistemological investigation of empirical knowing. What can we learn about the world that we have empirical knowledge of and our knowing of it, starting off with the crudest possible form of empirical self-consciousness, sense certainty, and just unfolding what's implicit in the commitments of that meta-conceptual categorical framework. We get to the point where seeing the deepest, most general structures of the empirical world as they've unfolded, law being rock bottom here, that it's a law-governed world, that we see that in order to understand that fully, we're going to have to understand what we're doing in making subjunctively robust inferences, which are part and parcel of making empirical, of stating empirical facts, and that are about the possession by empirical objects of empirical properties. We've got to look to see what we're doing. Consciousness, empirical consciousness, turns out to presuppose self-consciousness. That's why this last form of empirical self-consciousness, this metaconceptual construal of empirical knowing, motivates the narrative, the expository transition to a concern with norm-governed discursive practice and the practitioners who engage in it, which is where we turn in the next chapter. So let me pause there and say, a lot going on in these 34 paragraphs, and the way I've offered for us to understand it makes at least intelligible why people didn't understand what he was saying. It's much more intelligible with the wisdom of hindsight from our privileged position later in a tradition that finally came around to worrying about these modal issues. But if that's all right, then people who take Hegel philosophically seriously should be players in contemporary analytic metaphysics and our contemporary thinking about modality, because he's got a bold, radically different line than the orthodoxy in contemporary modal metaphysics. So, let me pause there from my rant.
May I ask?
Yes, please, Siddharth.
Thanks. Can you help me understand a little bit better why this view doesn't collapse to a kind of empiricism about modality? That is, why not, if what we're doing in using modal vocabulary is not sort of describing facts that are in a different ontological zip code, but sort of just bringing out what was always implicit in our ordinary use of empirical vocabulary, then why isn't it open for us to just be empiricist in a way that and sort of reduce or claim that all modality is just a kind of reduces to facts about observations or facts about sense data or something that's much more radical than the kind of view that you were suggesting Hegel has?
Well, I mean, there is a sense in which he thinks that modality is the subject of empirical knowledge. That is, he's saying that finding out what descriptions are true, that is, what the ground level facts are, and finding out what the laws are, those are two sides of one coin. When in a characteristic episode of empirical experience of error of the kind he started us off thinking about in the introduction, if I have the concept of an acid as something that has as its circumstances of application that something tastes sour, and its consequences of application that it'll turn litmus paper red, and I find something that tastes sour but turns litmus paper blue, so I acquired the commitment to the litmus paper being red inferentially from the fact that this was sour, therefore an acid, therefore red, and that's incompatible with my non-inferential observation that it's blue, and I need to change something. I've curled up in my toy concept of an acid a bad inference. The inference from if it tastes sour, then it'll turn litmus paper red. I just found that was a bad inference. That's a bad concept. That empirical experience can tell me well, you can't have that concept, you can't have that inference. And now maybe I go off and say, well, maybe it's only clear liquids that taste sour that are acids, or, I fiddle around at the edges, and we're, with our ordinary empirical concepts, come very late in a tradition of grooming them in that way. For the scientific ones, less so. But that's every bit as much the outcome of an experience of error as discovering that, what I took to be the fact that the stick was bent has the stick straight. I should say Paolo Camporese pointed out to me that it's misleading to just use the stick example, precisely because we can learn that we need different meanings from it. But I'm learning what the laws of nature are, what concepts to have, every bit as much as I'm learning facts in it. So we have empirical access to what the real properties are in this case. That that toy concept of an acid, that was not a real property. Nothing has that property. And that's a modal fact, and that's empirically available to us. So in that sense, an empiricist about modality, yeah, well, that's, we find out the laws of nature empirically through making these inferential commitments and finding that they work or that they don't work. That's not a commitment to empiricism that reduces everything to sense data or something like that. That's where we came in with sense certainty, was that sort of reductive empiricism. And I should say, the kind of modality that we're talking about is the modality that's codified in paradigmatically in laws of nature. If we want to make sense of metaphysical necessity, that's a different story. That's not Hegel's story about the modality that's implicit in the contents of our ground level descriptive empirical concepts doesn't address sort of that kind of modality. This other one, it means, for instance, that for him, if you want to find out what your words mean, you can't just introspect. You have to go in the laboratory and find out what copper really is. What are the circumstances and consequences of application of copper? That's an empirical undertaking.
Okay, so it's a kind of small e empiricism rather than sort of capital.
It's a non-reductive empiricism, and it's partly he's seeing what we see. What's observable for us goes a lot deeper for him than it did for Hume or for Locke. It includes all these lawful inclusion and exclusion relations to other observables in it. He thinks that in seeing that it's red, I can see that it's not blue. That's part of it. Because it's being red means it couldn't be blue. That's part of the experience, that modal articulation. And that's not the experience of some spooky modal fact. It's part of what the experience of a determinate empirical property is. Okay. Well, next week, something completely different. We're going to talk about normativity, normative subjects, discursive practice. I used to think that the transition between the sections of the book should be made just by turning the page. We talked about the one thing, we'll talk about something else. I now see substantive rationales for these narrative transitions, which are not historical transition, but it is a change of subject from consciousness to self-consciousness now. We have just a couple of minutes left. Let me descend to the historical and biographical about Hegel. We often complain about the circumstances under which we're trying to do our research and get things done. I am in the most privileged of all positions doing that, but many people, we've got the heavy teaching loads. Now we've got the pandemic. It's how is one to devote oneself to this? What Hegel had going on while he was doing this is this. This is the Battle of Jena. It was October 6th of 1806. This is from near the end, but Jena had been surrounded for months. So the whole time that Hegel was writing this book, when you look at it, Jena's in the distance beyond that church steeple. But for most of this time, Hegel would, at the end of his day's writing, go out and look at the battle, look at the siege lines. There's the French. That was exciting. It was also disturbing. And I find myself wanting to say to the young Hegel, he was essentially at that point half my current age, young man, Willy, okay, he was, don't do this. You might catch a stray bullet. This is not wise. Don't be doing this, Willy. He was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, but no one ever apparently called him Georg. He was Willy to his friends. And I feel that I've spent enough time with him, and when I'm thinking about the young Hegel, that I can think of him as Willy, as addressing him and say, look, don't do this. Parenthetically, no one has spent enough time to think of Kant as Manny. Don't go there. But this far, I'm willing to go. But you think how distracting the pandemic is, how hard it is to sort of sustain a line of thought. The French are closing in. There's artillery, there's bullets. This is what was going on while he's writing about the calm realm of laws, how we should understand modality, and so on. This is serious concentration that he was capable of. So anyway, have a thought for him. The 3 months in which he wrote this book, the ferocity of concentration that was involved in doing it is essentially superhuman, I think. Okay. I added some stuff to this week on the website late. In case you're curious, I added a piece of mine called Modal Expressivism and Modal Realism Together Again, which is a contemporary, I don't think I meant so much as mention Hegel in it, but a contemporary rehearsal of how some of these things, some of these issues about modality look from a contemporary point of view, if one has learned the lesson that I take it Hegel was trying to teach us about it. You probably know that Amy Thomason is a contemporary, maybe the most prominent contemporary modal expressivist who, without sort of having Hegel under her belt, has, though Sellers' version of it she has come around to develop and defend a non-descriptivist expressivist view of modality. And that's another place that one can look. But for an article length thing, I added that. Okay, well, thank you very much. I will see you next week.